Welcome to the Scholars Chair. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson said, "The good thing about science is that it is true whether you believe it or not." In the Scholars Chair from Prince George's Community College is Dr. James Christopher Hunt. He is professor in the Department of Physical Science and Engineering. We shall explore evolution of astronomy and why the study of this science is important. Our discussion will start right here in the Scholars Chair.
That's the physics behind, for example,
Another
reactions.
question people
The
ask
actual change in
under
mass.
the ultimate question about
During over the course of 7 years, the book was put together.
James, Dr. Hunt, welcome to the Scholars Chair.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. James, tell me about your background, your educational background, and before we get into our program.
I did bachelor's and master's degrees in physics, and then I switched and did a master's in history and philosophy of science, and I finished a PhD in something called Science and Technology Studies, which is an interdisciplinary field comprising history, philosophy, sociology of science, and some policy studies.
Wow. Wow, I didn't realize you and I told you before the program got started, you look so young. I can imagine.
I'll take that as long as I can get it.
Perfect. So tell me, the astronomy is sometimes called the first science, right? What is it?
Well, I guess one could generally define it as the study of celestial objects and systems, space, and even the whole universe.
And I remember when I was taking your course, actually, we were studying the Earth quite a bit in terms of the evolution of how it actually functioned. Is that a part of the science as well?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the study of the Earth, we're part of the universe, so it would fall within the parameters of astronomy to study it. I mean, what we have learned over the thousands of years astronomy has been practiced is that the Earth is not the central or most important object in the universe, which was our belief until very recently.
Yes, yes. Tell me about this. Why is it that some scientists call astronomy the first science?
Well, we have evidence that it was practiced, very good evidence. It's been practiced at least 5,000 years. There's some evidence that it might go back even considerably further. There's an artifact called the Shango bone, which is about probably 20,000 years old. Yeah. And there's varying interpretations of what it might be, but it could well be a lunar calendar. And so it's easy for me, at least, to imagine, ancient man, just looking up at the sky and, trying to figure out what it is and what makes it work and so on.
What got you interested in astronomy?
Oh, well, probably a couple of things. Some of my very earliest memories are of the Apollo moon landings, and my parents made sure I, was watching those, and it got me hooked from the get-go. And then around 1980, there was a show on PBS called Cosmos, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, A Personal Journey. And he was such a great communicator of science and in general and astronomy in particular. And it really did focus on a lot of the interdisciplinary aspects of it that I came to value. And this, of course, was the series that Neil deGrasse Tyson just recently remade. Yeah. So that probably played a very, very large role in choosing my field also.
Tell us from the beginning with the evolution of rational thought with the Greeks. Tell me, who is this Greek astronomer? I think it's pronounced Eratosthenes. Isn't I saying it?
Oh, Eratosthenes.
Thank you,
yeah.
Eratosthenes. Yes.
Well, so yeah, Eratosthenes was Greek ethnically, although I think he was born in what's now Libya. And his claim to fame was that he was the chief librarian at the Great Library in Alexandria. So if you've read any ancient history, Alexander the Great conquered the ancient world out to India and loved to do nothing more than found new cities and name them after himself.
Right.
So this one on the north coast of Egypt, he intended to be the capital of his empire, and he helped actually design it. And he intended for it to be a very cosmopolitan city, a city of learning. And one of the centerpieces of this was to be the Great Library. Now, he didn't live to see this, but when it finally got built, the goal of the Great Library was to collect a copy of every single work of scholarship that existed, which is quite a thing.
Yeah.
And so Eratosthenes landed this plum job of chief librarian, and he had heard that due south of Alexandria was a city called Syene.
Yes.
And it had something happen once a year that never ever happened in Alexandria, which is that high noon on the first day of summer, the sun was directly overhead. And that never happened in Alexandria. And from that one insight, he was actually to devise a geometrical method to calculate the circumference of the Earth.
And this is before astronomy, before any real hard science,
I wouldn't
algebra.
I wouldn't say that. This was about the 3rd century BCE, and depending on which experts we ask, he actually got very close to the correct value. But the origins of sort of what we might think of as classical astronomy, we can probably put about 300 years earlier.
Really?
Yeah. Lots of ancient cultures around the world developed astronomy. Virtually all of them developed astronomies in both hemispheres.
I just did a program on Newton, and Newton is credited to be the founder of.
Well, so everyone gets some sort of title, right? And because Newton comes up with the law of gravity, some people say, okay, well, we should, say
Give it to him.
Modern astronomy starts with him. But in any case, prior to the 6th century BCE, the astronomies of the ancient peoples all around the world were very practical in nature. They were, we need a calendar. We need to know when to plant the crops. We need to navigate. We need this for our religion. We need this for divination. Things like that.
Gotcha.
For some reason, that's still an object of scholarly debate. Around the 6th century BCE, in the Greek colonies in Asia Minor, the nature of the questions changed. So instead of when you see a planet moving a certain peculiar way over several months in the sky, instead of sort of saying, well, what can we use this for? What can we get out of it? The questions came to be, why is that happening? In other words, the idea of knowledge for its own sake. And that, along with the explanations being more rational in nature rather than chalking it up to chance or the act of some god or some theological explanation, the combination of assuming a rational explanation along with disinterested knowledge is sort of the birth of probably not only modern, or not only classical astronomy, but sort of the scientific way of thinking.
Eratosthenes claim to fame with the well and determining the angle and the distance and all that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's fascinating. It kind of brings together logic, some math, and astronomy.
Yeah, it's a neat little demonstration that he did. It's hard to explain without a diagram, but basically what he realized was, well, they already knew the Earth was a sphere. It's a common myth that Columbus was the first person in the history of planet Earth to realize the Earth was a sphere. That's absolutely false. So he knew it was a sphere, and what he realized was if he could measure the angle in between the sun and directly overhead at that magic moment in Alexandria, and doing just a little tiny bit of geometry, he could, and if you know the distance between the two cities, you can actually get the circumference of the Earth. And
did he get it right?
Well, it depends on how big a unit he used was. They weren't using, of course, our modern units. They were using units called stadia. So if a stadium was about 1/6 of a kilometer, which is what probably it's safe to say a majority of the scholars think, if a stadium was 1/6 of a kilometer, then he was within some few percent of the correct value. And it's absolutely ingenious. So not only did peoples all over the world in antiquity know the Earth was a sphere. Starting with Eratosthenes, 3rd century BCE, we knew how big around it was.
So that's really a remarkable and simple way of analyzing things. Now, tell me a little bit about this struggle between the geocentric and the heliocentric model. What is that all about, really, and why the struggle?
Well, so the question is, what's at the middle?
Right.
The first sort of approach to this was sort of a very understandably common sense approach. It sort of seems like the Earth is at the middle of everything, with everything going around us. So geocentric, Earth at the center. Importantly, it's also a geostatic model. So an important piece of that is that the Earth is held to be sitting still, which it certainly seems to be. So if that's what you believe, you then have to explain several different motions you see going on in the heavens, and you have to work up a model to try to do that. And they did. They worked up a very successful model. Now you can also work up a model that has the sun at the middle of not just the solar system, but the whole universe, and have the Earth going around it, and again try to tackle those observations you see in the sky, and you can nail them all. But the problem was the geocentric model came first, and if it appeals to common sense, if it gives decent answers, and it was there first, why bother replacing it?
I remember, I think it was in class, or you actually, I read it someplace, that Aristotle actually supported the idea of a static, centralized Earth, because he said that you could observe a bird leaving his nest, and when he came back, the nest was still in one place.
Yeah, so Aristotle thought he had a number of airtight proofs that the Earth could not be moving, and this is the basis on which he built his whole scientific worldview. Basically he argued, well, if imagine a bird in a nest, if the Earth were moving around the sun, as soon as the bird flaps his wings and leaves the nest, the Earth would zoom out from underneath it. And that made perfect sense at the time, because no one had developed a concept of inertia, something we all take for granted. We've all felt inertia every time we slam on our brakes in our car. We just want to keep on going naturally. So without that concept, he could argue convincingly that the Earth wasn't moving. He could also say, if the Earth's moving around the sun, how is the moon keeping up? I mean, they're not tied together with a big rope or anything like that. And so the missing concept there is gravity. So he had very good reasons for thinking that the Earth sat still. He had some less convincing arguments, but those I thought were, given the two missing concepts, I think it's entirely understandable.
And his the opposing argument, being a heliocentric model, who is introducing that?
Well, as near as we can gather, it was someone called Aristarchus of Samos, which is an island, and none of his works survive in full because, well, they were certainly in the library. So when the Great Library was burned, that's probably who knows what all was lost then. But he was quoted by so many people, like for instance Plutarch, that we can safely sort of assign credit to him as sort of the originator of the heliocentric cosmology. But it didn't catch on. So the point is, it's nearly as old as the geocentric view. It just didn't catch on until much later.
Now, we if I remember correctly, the retrograde motion was also a phenomenon that was reaffirming the heliocentric model. Am I correct in?
Well, so retrograde motion is something we observe in the sky. The word planet literally means wanderer. It's ancient Greek for wanderer. So anything that did not stay fixed in a given constellation forevermore, but instead wandered through them over various lengths of time, was considered a planet. And so by this ancient definition, which we held until just a few hundred years ago, the sun and the moon qualified. They were considered planets
Yes.
because the moon wanders through the zodiac over the month and so on. So 5 of the 7 planets, naked eye planets, are observed to occasionally, as they're wandering through the zodiac, just sort of go backwards. So that's what retrograde means, backwards. So the normal motion, again, this is a very slow motion. You wouldn't notice this over an evening. You would notice it over weeks or months. The normal motion is west to east, but occasionally they'd just change their minds and slow down and stop and go the other way. So one of the big challenges of any model of the universe is to explain this very peculiar behavior. So prior to the 6th century BCE, they might have chalked it up to some theological explanation.
Right.
So Mars is going backwards because the god Mars is angry, or there's a war coming, or something like that.
Yes.
But post 6th century BCE, more rational explanations were required. In the geocentric,
Why was it required?
well, this sort of shift in sort of attitude of the thinkers it sort of took. So the pre-Socratics and so on. And so in the geocentric sort of view, you have to get this done without moving the Earth. And so to do that, they had to add a bunch of other wheels to the system called epicycles. So instead of having everything going around the Earth on one circle, it was on 2, so that you can get the planets making sort of loop-de-loops.
Yes.
In the heliocentric model, you really don't have to do anything, because if we're moving around the sun and other planets are moving around the sun at different rates, it's sort of built in. So the way to visualize it is, if you're driving on the Capitol Beltway in the inner lane, and someone's driving in the outer lane, and he's going slower, presumably, and you pass him, well, from a naive point of view, it looks like he's going backwards, right?
Yes, yes.
So that's what's really causing the retrograde motion. It's when we pass another planet, or vice versa, and this is sort of apparent backwards motion sort of entails. So both of them can explain it.
Both models can explain it.
Yeah. And so the question was, which one explains it better?
I see.
And for the longest time, people said the geocentric model explained it better with the extra wheels.
Well, it was less complicated. Okay, gotcha.
Well,
Right.
they were about even in complication in a lot of ways. But the idea of the Earth's being still was so embedded in the worldview that they actually preferred the prior explanation.
And we get to the worldview and the whole the struggle with the heliocentric versus the geocentric models were being supported by political and religious communities, specifically the Catholic Church. Can you kind of give a little bit of background to why the Catholic Church actually absorbed the Ptolemy and the Aristotle model? And
Right. So this is a good example of how science is a human enterprise, and it's done by people who live in societies. Right. So there are these sort of social forces that can affect the way science unfolds.
yes.
So the Roman Empire falls in the late 400s, and while science and technology didn't come to a full halt in Europe, it certainly slowed down to sort of a glacial creep.
Right.
And a lot of the ancient sources, the Greek sources, Aristotle and so on, started to disappear. Now, thankfully, they were preserved and commented on and improved in what would become the great Islamic cultures of the day. But until that happened, until these started making their way back into Europe, the church sort of had a very negative attitude towards all Greek philosophy.
I see.
So there were a couple of primary reasons, but one of them was that these ancient Greeks were not Christians. Right? They lived before Christ, and furthermore, if the entire idea behind the theology is to get to heaven, if this is just a way station, what's the point in studying it?
Right.
You should focus on salvation.
Yes.
So, in fact, Tertullian once said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Well, so these texts start to trickle back into Europe, and what particularly helped facilitate this believe it or not, was the Moorish conquest of Spain in 711,
Yes.
Tariq. And so all of a sudden there's a conduit from the Islamic world up into Europe. So these texts have been translated from Greek to Arabic, and now they're going to be translated back into Latin. And people started studying them, but it's kind of a risky business because, again, the church sort of frowned on it in a lot of ways. And this changes in the 13th century. And the prime mover here is Thomas Aquinas. He essentially what he did was he made an argument to the church, which is if we believe that God created the universe, the world we live in, everything, what better way to get closer to God than to study his handiwork? In other words, there's two books. There's the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And so this in academic circles is called the handmaiden argument.
Yes.
So science can be a handmaiden to religion.
Yeah.
And this worked. And they particularly liked Aristotle because he was a geocentrist. So again, if the idea is everything was created for us, we're the ultimate creation, where would God put his ultimate creation except at the center? So because of this sort of resonance with the theological doctrines of the day, not only did they decide they really liked Aristotle, all these Aristotelian notions get sort of intertwined with the theology. So by the time folks like Copernicus and Galileo come along, you can't just roll out of bed one day and say, oh, you know what, I think it's the Earth going around the sun and not vice versa.
Right.
Because it has all these theological implications about where we sit relative to God.
Yes, and then of course is the political power. You're sitting at the center and the seat of power, which is
oh, sure.
Which I'm sure is,
after the empire fell, the church became the premier social and political power in Europe. And in addition to the church, there were also sort of what we might call the establishment scholars who were Aristotelians. They were called the schoolmen or the scholastics or the peripatetics. And while not as powerful as the church, there was this other faction sort of rooting for sort of the old way of thinking.
So this looked like I should have taken Astronomy 102. It seems there's a lot to learn. Tell me about this guy we've been mentioning, Copernicus. Who is this guy, and what does he mean to the science?
So Copernicus was a Polish canon. Which is a sort of a type of a church functionary. And what had happened was that by the 1500s, the church had discovered that a 10-day error had entered into the calendar. The calendar, the Julian calendar, which the whole of Europe was working on more or less, had drifted 10 days off the seasons. So the church mandated that the calendar had to be reformed. Since astronomers are involved in timekeeping and so on, they were enlisted to do this. And so this is how Copernicus gets involved with this project of reforming the calendar. And here's where he had an insight that none of his contemporaries apparently had, which is, okay, we could possibly fix the calendar by adding more little fixes to the geocentric model.
Right.
Or we could just try a new model, or rather not a new model, let's go back to this model of Aristarchus, which never caught on and had been sitting on dusty bookshelves for, 1,500 years or something like that.
Yes.
So about 1512, he revives the heliocentric model. And it's not our sort of modern view, because first of all, this is a model of the whole universe, not just what we now call the solar system. But he also had everything going in perfect circular orbits, which is interesting. Even he, who said, okay, maybe the Earth's moving after all, he didn't have the sort of insight to say that things could be moving in anything except a perfect circle. They were really wedded to the idea of perfection in the heavens, even Copernicus. So to fix his model, he had to put in little epicycles to sort of make the predictions more accurate. But it was still a step forward, I'm going to argue. And he circulated a draft of this idea amongst his colleagues as early as 1514. But he didn't publish his big book on the subject until the end of his life.
I see. Yes. Yes.
Well,
didn't he get persecuted because of this?
No. He was never persecuted for his ideas. There's a few ideas on that. One of them is that that early draft I mentioned, I think he circulated it anonymously.
I see.
Second, it's possible that the church was in sort of a more liberal phase at that time.
Yeah.
It's another possibility. Many people do think he waited to the end of his life to avoid sort of getting hassled from his colleagues or the church or whoever for publishing this revival of the heliocentric model.
Yeah.
But there's every indication he did believe it was real. And his book, 1543, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, is generally considered the thing that starts the scientific revolution.
This is Copernicus.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it took a while to catch on, but and there's lots of stories about how that happened. Yeah. But if you really want to have one date that most people say, okay, if we're gonna pinpoint it, when did the scientific revolution start? It would be that date, 1543. And what's interesting is he didn't roll out of bed one day to start the scientific revolution. He just wanted to fix the calendar, at least.
He wanted to make these days come out right. Tycho Brahe, I think is.
Tycho Brahe, yeah. Tycho was lived much later. He died in 1601. He was a Danish nobleman and astronomer, and the telescope was invented around 1608. So Tycho's often referred to as the last great pre-telescope astronomer.
Is this what the sextant is?
So he had a number of astronomical instruments that he used to make measurements of the positions of the planets relative to the stars. And one of them was a sextant, so it's a device that's a sixth of a circle, 60 degrees, and you use it to measure altitude, how high something is above the horizon. He had quadrants, which is a quarter of a circle also. Some of these could measure azimuth, which is where something is along the horizon in addition to altitude, just dependent on how they were set up. But he was well known for being a meticulous observer. And he had some other claims to fame as well, but the primary one is he left all this data to one of his, in his will after he died, he left all this data to one of his collaborators, Johannes Kepler, who did a great number of wonderful things with it.
You're moving into Jonathan Kepler, so tell us about him a little bit. Law of planetary motion? Yeah,
so Kepler was a German mathematician, and word sort of spread that he was really good at math. He was a bit of a mystic at first. Was very into numerology and astrology, which at that time was still intertwined with astronomy, but no, unquestionably very brilliant at mathematics. And so what happened was Tycho, towards the end of his life, realized he needed a collaborator to help him with the math parts of things. So Tycho was the observer, and he hired Kepler to help with some of the computations.
To make it work.
But they didn't get along very well, is the problem.
Last question. It's said that Newton is one of the most brilliant contributors to astronomy in the history of all astronomy. Do you agree?
Well, I would say he's certainly probably the greatest scientist who ever lived.
Then we have another astronomer's point of view. That's three good 3 points for Isaac Newton. So, well, that's another Scholar's Chair. Thank you, Professor Hunt,
My
for
pleasure.
showing up. We've been talking to Professor Hunt about the evolution of astronomy. And if you want to see more programs on the Scholar's Chair, you can go to the Read One channel at YouTube. And if you wish to send us an email, you can do so at scholarschair@gmail.com. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.
amazing.